Imagine an empire with no way to keep meat from rotting, no way to pay its soldiers, and no way to move armies across a continent without them starving before they ever reached a battlefield. That's a world without salt. And for most of human history, that's exactly the world people lived in. Salt wasn't a seasoning sitting quietly next to the pepper. It was survival. It was currency. It was the invisible infrastructure holding civilizations together. So, here's the real question. If salt had never existed, would Rome have ever become an empire at all? The answer says more about how empires are actually built than any textbook chapter on emperors and battles ever could. Let's start with the body. Before refrigeration, before canning, before any modern method of preservation, humans had exactly one reliable way to keep food from spoiling across seasons. Salt draws water out of meat and fish through osmosis, and without that water, bacteria can't grow. No salt means no preserved food. No preserved food means no surplus. No surplus means no armies that can travel more than a few days from home before running out of supplies. Every ancient civilization that expanded beyond its immediate borders had to solve this problem first. Rome solved it better than almost anyone before it, and salt was the tool that made that possible. Rome sat near natural salt flats close to the mouth of the Tiber River, at a place called Ostia. Some historians believe this access to salt production is one of the reasons a small settlement in central Italy grew into something larger than its neighbors. Salt pans there produced a steady, controllable supply, which meant Rome could preserve food at a scale its rivals couldn't easily match. And once you can preserve food at scale, you can feed an army that doesn't need to stop and forage every few miles. That single logistical advantage, feeding soldiers reliably over long distances, is one of the quiet engines behind Roman military expansion. Here's where it gets even more interesting. One of the oldest roads in Italy is called the Via Salaria, the Salt Road. It stretched from Rome into the Sabine territories, and its entire purpose was moving salt inland to communities that had no coastal access. Think about what that means. Long before Rome conquered half of Europe, it was already building infrastructure specifically to move a single resource across hundreds of miles. That road became a template. The same logistical thinking, build a path, move a valuable resource, connect distant communities to a central hub, became the blueprint for the entire Roman road network that later moved legions, grain, and administrators across 3 continents. Now, here's the part most people get slightly wrong. There's a popular idea that Roman soldiers were literally paid in salt, and that this is where the word salary comes from. The real history is murkier than that. What we know for certain is that Roman soldiers received a salarium, an allowance connected to the cost of salt, which they used to buy provisions, salt very much included. Whether or not coins of salt ever changed hands directly, the connection between military pay and salt was real enough that the word survived 2,000 years and now sits in your paycheck. That's not a small linguistic accident. That's a fossil, a piece of ancient economic reality still buried inside modern language. But the deeper impact wasn't the word. It was the logistics behind it. A Roman legion on the march needed enormous quantities of preserved meat and fish to survive extended campaigns. Without salt, soldiers would have been limited to whatever fresh food they could carry or forage, which meant short campaigns, weak sieges, and armies that couldn't hold territory far from home for long. Salted meat and salted fish, along with a fermented fish sauce called garum that Romans put on almost everything, meant soldiers could carry calorie-dense, long-lasting food for weeks. An army that can eat reliably is an army that can stay in the field. And an army that can stay in the field is an army that can conquer. This is where the story usually stops in most retellings. Salt fed the army built the empire, end of story. But there's a layer underneath that almost nobody talks about, and it might be the most important one. Salt wasn't just a supply problem. It became a control problem. Whoever controlled salt production and distribution controlled a resource that every single person in the empire needed, regardless of class, region, or wealth. Rich or poor, you needed salt to preserve your food and stay alive. That universal dependency made salt one of the easiest resources in history to tax. Roman authorities understood this, and control over salt production, particularly around key sites like Ostia, became tightly regulated. This wasn't just about profit, it was about power. A government that controls a resource everyone needs has leverage over everyone, all the time, without needing to say a single threatening word. Centuries later, other governments would take this lesson to an extreme. France's infamous salt tax, the gabelle, became one of the most hated taxes in European history and helped fuel resentment that contributed to the French Revolution. Rome never pushed salt taxation to that breaking point, but the underlying principle, that controlling a basic necessity gives you quiet control over an entire population, was already visible in Roman administration centuries earlier. So, if salt had never existed, the failure wouldn't have been a single missing seasoning on a Roman dinner table. It would have been a structural collapse at every level Rome depended on. No reliable food preservation means no long military campaigns. No long campaigns means no distant conquests. No distant conquests means no provinces to tax, no roads built to move resources, no administrative network stretching from Britain to Egypt. The road system, the legions, the currency, the very idea of a centralized empire managing distant territories, all of it rests on a foundation that assumes armies and cities can be fed reliably over time and distance. Remove salt, and that foundation cracks before Rome ever gets the chance to become Rome. There's a strange kind of irony sitting at the center of this. We tend to imagine empires being built by great generals, brilliant strategists, or ruthless politicians, and certainly those people mattered. But underneath every one of those famous names was a far less glamorous reality. A preserved fish sauce, a salt pan by a riverbank, a dusty road built purely to move white crystals from the coast to the interior. The empire wasn't just built by ambition, it was built by logistics, and logistics were built on salt. So the next time you shake a little salt onto your food without thinking twice about it, consider this. That small, unremarkable mineral once decided whether an army could march, whether a city could grow, whether an empire could survive its own ambitions. Rome didn't just use salt. Rome was built on top of it, road by road, ration by ration, tax by tax. And if that mineral had never existed, there's a real chance the greatest empire the ancient world ever produced would have stayed exactly what it started as, a small, hungry settlement on the banks of a river, going nowhere at all.